In this video, we are going to take this render brush that we've just created and put it to use creating this scene that you see in front of you. Now, this is probably the most basic lighting situation I could possibly conceive of. I have a spherical object with no features in a blank environment lit by a single light source. But even with that, as uncompelling as it is still believable. And it's believable because I've paid attention to some rather key concepts when it comes to rendering form. Now, the first and foremost of these is value. Now, when artists talk about value, they often refer to it as a value scale. I'm just going to open up a value scale. You can see on our value scale at the extreme right, we have absolute white. On the left, we have absolute black as we can make. And then we have the gradated steps, 10% change each time in between. This is often referred to our value scale, and artists will give each one of these value steps a number. 0 being absolute white, 10 as your absolute black, and then 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 in sequence. Now, using this value scale, we can use that to describe our form here. Now, I have like I say, a very featureless sphere. And of course, it has a highlight. Its highlight value is, well, close to 2 here, I would say. Then its core shadow, its darkest part of its shadow, is probably around here, around a 7, maybe approaching an 8. So using this value scale, we can describe form. Now, we will talk about this in a little bit more detail in just a moment. But value does a little bit more than just allow us to describe form. It's also a compositional aid. I'm using value here to describe this scene. I have a light foreground object contrasted against a dark background, and that allows me to see this form much more easily. If I were to change those values, I'm just going to open up my curves here for this, and let's change that background to something much lighter. You can see that at some point there is a value where it becomes hard to discern the foreground versus the background. By leaving the values as they were, I have a much more composed scene, in this case a light foreground, dark background. I just want to quickly talk about a different lighting situation here. I've used value here in a different way. I've got a central figure composed in a very dark situation being contrasted against a very light background. If I take the color away, you can still see that the composition still retains its solidity because of use of value. I'm using areas of high contrast to control the viewer's eye to our main figure and this main situation up here. Using a descending scale of value, I've proceeded into the background here. So my darkest in the buildings back here never gets to above about 5 or 6. And then even further still in these distant buildings, my values never get above around 5 or 4. So you can see that by using value, I can really compose an image, not just use it to describe form. Okay, let's come back to our sphere here, and I'm going to turn on a few labels because I do want to talk a little bit about the importance of what these features actually tell us. One of the most important, of course, is our highlight. Now, our highlight tells us a number of important things. First of all, it's telling us what direction our light source is coming from. In this case, it's coming from the upper right. It's also telling us a little bit about the color of that light. Now, unfortunately, I'm talking about this in terms of black and white and value. I don't actually have any color to talk about here. But one thing I do want to describe is the fact that you never see white as a highlight color. White is just far too bright for a highlight color. You're always going to see somewhere around 1 or 2. But beyond what the highlight is telling us about the light source, it's also telling us something about the surface of the object being lit. Now, right now, this is a very smooth gradient from its highlight area to its core shadow. This is suggesting something like a billiard ball or something hard. But if I were to change that highlight just by adding a little bit of texture to it, you can see all of a sudden my object has become soft. It's no longer a billiard ball, it's an orange or a citrus of some sort. And this is true for highlights. The highlight will often show texture more easily than any other value across your object. So if you are going to suggest texture, do so in your highlight. We also have our core shadow. Now our core shadow is the area that is receiving the least amount of light. The value of our core shadow is going to tell us how much light is in this room, how much ambient light is there reflected around off other surfaces back into this shadow, lightening it. If we're in a very dark room, of course, this shadow is going to be much darker. If we're in a light room, that shadow will be lighter. Again, we also have something here called reflected light. That reflected light is, again, this light coming off, in this case, the surface that this object is sitting on. If I have secondary light sources, in this case I don't, I only have the one light source, but I could have other light sources coming in here, lighting this object in odd ways as well. But in this case, I just am working with reflected light, and that is enough to keep that core shadow from going too dark. Now, one thing to consider is our reflected light is never that bright. It's never going to be brighter than our highlight color, but it can be very dramatic. If used well, reflected light can be a very dramatic way of defining form. Okay, finally, let's talk about the halftone, and that is the midpoint in value between our highlight and our darkest part, or our core shadow. Now, getting this halftone right is key, and that'll be important in our next exercise when we work with our render brush, making sure that we understand where our mid value is. So let's move on to actually creating this scene.